Howdy all, grab yourselves a beer. It is time to talk some Path of Exile. And today I want to talk about the 9 things that, in my opinion, sabotage the Synthesis League. This is the short version of the video. I've also done a much longer version, but when that blew out over an hour, I thought I'd better record a too long didn't watch version. Both videos are designed as something that you don't need to actively be paying attention to the screen to watch, so it's the sort of thing that if you're driving somewhere, treat it like a podcast and just play it as a sound only video if you'd like. I want to start by saying I've had a blast with the Synthesis League. As a mid-level crafter, there's been lots of niches to explore, lots of weird and wonderful crafts to figure out how to do, both for myself and to sell to other players. And the Nexus zones and the Memory Fragments inside maps have been a sort of great concentrated dose of monster killing that's considerably more dangerous than maps and also considerably more rewarding. I don't for a second regard this as a terrible league like I would regard Bestiary, or as a mediocre to bad one like I would Betrayal. However, I will accept that I'm in the minority on that front, and it does seem that the majority of people preferred Betrayal to Synthesis so far, for instance, and even Bestiary seems to be comparably received to Synthesis now. I think ultimately the league suffered a lot for going live a week before it was ready, and this poisoned the well badly by giving a bad first impression. But just quickly, the positives for the league, I think the concentrated burst of monster killing in both Memory Fragments and Nexus zones has been great. And the durable rare monsters in Nexus zones that actually live long enough to use meaningful telegraphed attacks has been a refreshing change from ha surprise, the monster died and it had an after death effect that killed you. The splitting of crafting into 2 distinct parts, so first crafting the desired implicits on an item, and then later potentially yourself, potentially someone else, completing the item from that point, has been a really interesting new form of crafting that's totally different to the usual style of, you acquire a base by running either the Shaper or Uber Elder, getting yourself your item level 86 Shaper or item level 86 Elder base, and then crafting from that. I think it's been a really interesting effect on the meta. And lastly, there's been the effect on the economy, where if you're watching the video as well, you'll see that until recently, and when I say recently, I do mean as recently as just before Easter, so 3 or 4 days ago, Exalted Orbs had been about the lowest they've been in Chaos Orbs in a long time, whereas some other currencies like Scouring Orbs are the highest they've been in a long time. I argue in more detail in the longer version of the video that I think this favours casual players because they end up being considerable consumers of Exalted Orbs, who are basically, it's either casual players paying for the top end crafting mods, the ones that become their sort of forever gear. You force 2 good mods on an item and then you multi-mod it from there, and you put your tier 1 crafts on it, and you make something that for a power gamer would just be a stepping stone item, but for a casual gamer, this is their whole of league goal, is to get this amazing item. They work hard for it, they get it, and they're like, oh yes, this is great. But the vast majority of the crafting of those items is Exalted Orbs. On the flip side, crafting items that they don't use very much, like Orbs of Scouring, have been considerably more valuable in this league than ever before. In fact, Scouring Orbs have pulled up Orbs of Chance because there's a vendor recipe to turn Chance Orbs into Scouring Orbs at 4-1, and that's the reason that Orbs of Chance is so expensive this league. They're almost... an Orb of Chance is almost as much as an Orb of Fusing this league, which is unprecedented. Now, casual players aren't net users of Orbs of Scouring. That's really something that Power Gamer crafters have been doing in this league. This has meant that a whole lot of, that basically the cost to get your forever gear, if you're a casual player, is probably the lowest it's been in any recent league. So I think that's quite a good economic change. That's the things I've liked about the league. Let's get on to the 9 things that I think hurt it. So, firstly, it released unfinished. Until patch 3.6.3, many of the most interesting crafts were not available. This completely killed excitement in fractured items entirely, and it poisoned the well against synthesis crafting. Lots of people who would normally look into all of the details of a new crafting system instead said, oh, well, that's not finished during the first 20 days, and by the end of that 20 days, they'd just lost excitement in the league. Maybe they did continue looking at that point, but they just sort of thought, yeah, I'll come back next league, and if it goes core, I'll learn more about it then. It was just a case of a bad first impression because the league released unfinished. The second problem was that the way that decay is random felt a lot like making blind jumps in 1980s platformers. You know, where you're like, you're playing a two-dimensional platform game, you run, you press jump, and you're hoping that you're hoping that you've pressed jump at the right time. You have no agency in. You feel like you've got no agency in whether you succeed or fail. It all comes down to a choice that the level designer has made. Or in the case of fractured memories in synthesis zones, inside the maps, it's the decision you make in the first couple of seconds of which direction to start moving. You end up making the wrong decision sometimes and just basically failing the memory fragment immediately. Really unsatisfying. Now, this is actually only a first impression problem. Once you learn a bit more about the mechanics of the league, you end up realizing that actually there are ways to work out which way it's going to collapse and then use that to know which way to path around the zone, whether you need to go to the northeast first, then the northwest, or whatever. But first impressions matter, and the first impressions synthesis gives were bad. Third problem that I raise is that it is as complex as Delve, but less rewarding than Delve, and therefore it was overshadowed by Delve in pretty much every way because Delve was still in the game. And I just want to show you a little bit of evidence to back that up, and that is that Sulfite Scarabs are now going for 75 Chaos Orbs. They're not going for 75 Chaos Orbs because casual players are buying one here and one there. They're going for 75 Chaos Orbs because they are delving is so lucrative that the people that are major economic players are buying 20, even 50 at a time. At these prices, then using them all, flooding the market with all of their drops, and then going straight back into the mines with all of the drops that they've liquidated. So you'll notice as well that Sulfite Scarabs are this expensive despite being every bit as rare as other Scarabs. So for instance, Gilded Reliquary Scarabs. These are created via exactly the same means as Gilded Sulfite Scarabs, and yet, so the supply is actually comparable. It's just that the demand for Reliquary Scarabs stops sharply at about 8 chaos. No one's really willing to buy them at more than 8 chaos, and so even though the supply is very low, they're not selling at that price. On the flip side, the demand for Gilded Sulfite Scarabs at 75 chaos remains high enough that there are plenty of people still buying them. So that's Delve. Now, the thing that comes up with this, Delve had a high learning curve. You had to learn about how the fractured walls work, how to find fractured walls, how to find passageways that conceal behind fractured walls, all sorts of other things like that. However, that was worth going through that learning experience because the rewards were so high. The problem with the Nexus is that it isn't so high that people feel compelled to engage in it, and so it just ends up being maybe I'll do it, maybe I won't. People that are power gamers, their approach is actually to go, well, I could go to play the Nexus, but why bother when I can just buy more Sulfite and go and delve more and I'll get better rewards. And any of the rewards that come out of the synthesis zones, I will just use my extraordinary loot gained from delving to go and buy those rewards. So anyways, Delve has overshined synthesis the synthesis nexus in this way. Fourth up in terms of problems, naive use of the synthesizer, i.e. people that don't extensively research how to use it, they don't get any good results at all. Again, this comes down to first impressions and poisoning the well. The first time you use a synthesizer, if you haven't done extensive research, you are going to get crap. Contrast this to if you take, say, frigid or metallic fossils and stick them on leveling gloves, just a set of rare gloves you might use while you're leveling. You can make some truly amazing gloves that, yeah, you're not going to use them at endgame, but you might still be quite happy to use those gloves all the way through the axe. You know, you might have crafted them as early as Act 4 and then said, oh well, this set of gloves is now just so amazing that I'm just going to use it all the way through the axe. You're not going to create anything with the synthesizer early in the game that is going to stand up in even the mid-game, let alone the late game. I like to think of this as complexity should be a prerequisite for excellence in a crafting system, but not a prerequisite for mediocrity. And understanding the complexity of a synthesizer is actually a prerequisite to make even mediocre gear, much less to make extraordinary gear. So yeah, that's my fourth point. Fifth point is something that didn't affect me personally, but betrayal lag needs to be fixed. Really needs to be fixed. And this has been affecting people on low-end systems, particularly people with mechanical hard drives. It's obviously a really serious problem, and many of the players that are affected by it are the sort of influencers that then will start saying, oh yeah, don't bother with Path of Exile until they fix this. To be fair, if you have a solid state drive and you've loaded Path of Exile on it, I don't believe you will experience betrayal lag. But if you're using a mechanical drive, to be honest, I'd go as far as to say that you probably don't want to continue playing beyond the point that you get into red maps. Sixth point I want to make is that the bosses were too easy at release, and this is going to be controversial. However, so the bosses were too easy. They just didn't feel like a climactic end fight. They felt like a speed bump, like a middle to upper tier map boss was. I'm of the opinion that bosses should kick your ass the first time you fight them and make you feel that you need to get better in order to beat them. This was my experience with Uber Elder. I had a lot of fun with Uber Elder. About the first 6 times I attempted the fight, I died on all 6 portals. Then finally, I got better. I learnt more about the fight. I improved my character. I practiced some of the dodging that's necessary in the fight, and I refined a few techniques. Doing all of this got me to the point that I got better and I was able to beat the fight, and that felt great. Contrast this to the experience that I had with the synthesis bosses, where in the first 2 weeks I'd just go into a rewritten distant memory and just go like, oh, was that a boss? So the bosses got made harder. The thing was that the way that they were made harder was terrible. And in fact, it would have been better for them to have been left as they were. For them to have been left as a sort of letdown, because the way that what they were changed into was something that was just extraordinarily more difficult than anything else in the game. So, you find people that can beat Uber Elder deathless consistently find that they're, failing the Cortex, but failing it on the 3rd boss, not even getting up to the 4th one. And this is because the map mods that go in there are not ones that were tailored to boss fights. I really think that the fix that needs to happen, and again, this has come up because Synthesis was rushed and came out earlier than it should have. The fix that should happen is that map mods bosses should have their own pool of map mods that are different to the ones that trash mobs are benefit from. My 7th item that I want to raise is that the 10 memory limit was just too much of an interruption to the flow of mapping. 10 memories works well with the actual Nexus board game setup. 10 is a good number for that. However, not being able to store more of them means that once you hit 10, you feel, oh, I really kind of need to go to the Nexus now. I need to interrupt what I'm doing. However, spawning Uber Elder typically, let's say that, that's my experience this league. I've been running Uber Elder a lot. And spawning Uber Elder typically takes maybe 15 maps. So you get you're close to spawning Uber Elder, and then it's like, oh, I've got to interrupt this and go do the Nexus thing. I think that you should have some mechanism by which you can store up more than 10 memory tiles. There'd be a whole other video, like I've got some ideas about how synthesis could and should go core, but with significant changes, but that would be a whole extra video, so I won't get into that here. But there's just too many diversions from mapping at the moment, when mapping is an activity that feels best when it's fluid and chained. The 8th item I want to raise, I'm only going to touch on here, I'm not going to go into any real detail, but I feel that players did not get enough upper yellow maps and low red maps during the time that they found lower yellow maps still to be engaging to run. So what I mean by that is that there's a point at which your character power is such that tier 6, 7 and 8 maps feel fun. This doesn't last very long because your character just explodes in power around the time that you gain access to, Shaper and Elder items for the first time. At the start of the league, you start trading and picking up items. You start getting yourself a 5 link for the first time. Maybe you get lucky and even get a 6 link. Your character just explodes in power from about level 67 when you might have killed Katava to about level 80 when you sort of feel like you're running tier 7, tier 8 maps. The problem here is that you run out of content that you've got access to that feels engaging before you've got enough of the new content. So, you're running all these 6, 7 and 8 maps. They feel too easy, but you don't yet have enough tier 9, 10, 11 maps to actually move up. Now, actually, I think map drop rates are fine, except at the start of the league. And I'm not even talking about the I'm not even talking here about the hotfix, because I went through this phase on day 2 of the league. The hotfix took place on day 7. I went through not having enough tier 6, 7, 8. Sorry, not having a lot of tier 6, 7 and 8 maps, but not getting enough 9s, 10s, 11s and 12s. I went through this phase and I found that 6s, 7s and 8s were just getting boring. Now, I know a lot of map sustain tricks, so I was able to just power through a little bit, do a little bit of trading, get myself to a point where I had Zana's Shaper tier 1 to 5 map, and at that point you have unlimited tier 10 maps. So from that point onwards, I had no map sustain issues. But players that don't know all of the map sustain tricks, this part of the league was just really unpleasant. And this is then going to flow into the next point that I'm going to make, which is about trading. The way that most players short-circuit this in general is actually to just buy maps off other players in order to get a head start with their Atlas. So the very first people who get into the Atlas, they know all the tricks. They very quickly get into red maps, and they stay in red maps, and they get a shitload of yellow maps, a shitload of low red maps, and they sell them at exorbitant prices to other players. Those other players buy these maps and then start selling their excess drops as they sort of work their way up the Atlas tiers. They sell their excess maps to other players. But in any case, the net result is that we out-level early maps before we have access to higher ones. And this feels really bad early in the league. And again, it's a bad early impression in the league. I've got some suggestions about what to do with that. I think one of the main ones is increasing the drop rates specifically of tier 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 maps. But that would be an entire other video, and I'm not going to go into that in the short version of this video. The last point is trade. I'm not going to go into a rant about how bad trade is in this game, but what I do want to do is just say that the mechanics of the synthesizer require extensive trading for obscure niche items, and all of the way that trade is set up in this game rewards antisocial operators that basically abuse the weaknesses of the trade system in order to trick people out of the loot they've earned through legitimate gameplay. And that toxic minority have been empowered considerably by the synthesis mechanics. The actual fix to this would be a whole other video, but there's lots of disagreements amongst the player base as to what would be done. But I think in general that the trade is bad in normal leagues, but in a league where trading is required for one of the major mechanics of the league, it goes from bad to awful. And ultimately, I think the most serious problem with synthesis as a league has not been any of the issues with decay, it's not been the issues with it releasing unfinished. The most serious one has been that it has caused all of the problems that already existed with trading in Path of Exile to become much, much, much worse than they otherwise would be. In any case, that's the short version of this video. If you want to see the longer version, it will be uploaded at about the same time. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, have a good one.